elementary school years, I lived in Chicago. And my grandparents and the rest of my extended family all lived in Ohio. So whenever we would make the trek for vacations or whatever, we piled in the car. And I have one brother who's 18 months younger than I am. And so we kind of sat, there weren't car seats or large vans with fancy movie players or any of that. So we sat in the back of our little red Monza, trying not to annoy one another. But eventually, the inevitable happened, and it sort of went like this. He's poking me, and not, and he's on my side, and not. And then I would eventually, or my brother, R2, Mom, you need to do something. This, kind of went on. Well, every single time we went to Ohio, this is how it went. So my mom, who is a very wise woman, I've come to realize, always brought with her a roll of masking tape. And she really was one of these moms who would take the masking tape out and she would put it down the line of the car. And she would also put it up the back of the seat. So we couldn't do this with our shoulders either. So we sat there, me on one side and my brother on the other side, which we needed to be divided, but totally disconnected from what the other needed or wanted. It says here, 2 men went up the temple to pray. And a line was drawn between the two. The line was not as easy to see as this masking tape that I had out here this morning, but it is much harder to remove that line that's drawn between the people. So we had the Pharisee on one side, and we had the tax collector on the other side, and in their mind, they had God up here in the temple, with all these dividing lines drawn between every. What I find really interesting is that it says they went up to the temple to pray, to do the right thing. Both of them. They both went to the temple to try to do the right thing. And even though they were at the temple, there were still lines drawn between them. As soon as, no matter where you are, as soon as lines are drawn, especially in the church, we lose sight of what standing at the foot of the temple really means. And the point is not that one's supposed to be made right and one's supposed to be wrong. Because as soon as we start saying, well, the Pharisee was just too proud, then we've drawn a line. As soon as we start saying, well, the tax collector, he was humble, so he did it right, well, then we've drawn another line. And as soon as we start saying, well, the temple is the place to go for God's chosen people, then we've drawn another line. So could it be that what Jesus is most concerned about is not who's right and who's wrong, but rather Jesus is concerned about what the cause for the separation is? And if this is the case, in this parable, and today, does the temple actually have a role in the separation of the people? Because I don't think it's an accident that this happens at the temple. Which leads me to a few questions that I have this morning for you all. And you don't have to have answers to them all because I don't have the answers to all these questions. But I have been thinking and dreaming and hoping a lot about them. So the first question is sort of an easy one. Why did the tax collector go to the temple? Because he certainly didn't go because he was supposed to go or his mom made him. He wasn't supposed to be there. And he certainly didn't go to feed the hungry or help the poor because he's a tax collector. He's helped to make the hungry and the poor. The tax collector went for only one reason: to meet God, to be in communion with God, to pray to God. Jesus saw the temple also as this type of place, a place to meet God. If you remember, we don't read this today, but if you remember earlier in Luke, when Jesus is about 12, he stays in the temple, and his mom and dad leave, and they don't know where he is. And when they realize he's gone and they come back for him, they say, well, we've been searching every place for you. And he says, didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? The temple was God's house for Jesus too. Jesus cares a lot about the temple. So you fast forward 15 years or so when Jesus is telling this parable. I think he's concerned mostly that some people were meeting God and some people weren't. Either because they weren't allowed to or because of their own self-righteousness got in the way. The very place that was supposed to be home, the very place that was supposed to be holy and right and lovely, was fractured. And Jesus saw this, and he saw the lines that were drawn in the temple. And then he told this parable of divisions. Which brings me to my second question. What about today? Do people see the church as a place to meet God? This week I've had a few fascinating conversations about the status of the institutional church. And there are many, many reasons for this. The church body as a whole, not just Lutherans, but the church body as a whole has had to cut back on positions, has had to let faithful people go. And this includes administrative work, it includes people at the National Lutheran Home, it includes missionaries. The institutional church is undergoing major change. And I love the church. Not more than I love Jesus, but I love the church. She has served me well, and I have grown up in the church. I have met God in the church. I have known resurrection in the church. And probably most of you are here for the exact same reasons. We know that God, in some way, can indeed be met in a church. Not only in a church, but in a church. So saying all that, sometimes I look at the church today and cry, honestly. I have sat in my bed late at night and cried over her. And I have sat in conference rooms at coffee shops and blinked back tears as the status of the church was discussed. So I probably don't even have to ask you the third question is, because you're probably asking yourselves, but why? Why cry over the church? And it's because of these words that I said to my pastor, who I've known for 15 years, as I sat in a coffee shop with him this week, and we were dreaming and visioning and hoping for the church. But I said this, I said, the model, the church model, it doesn't work anymore for some people. At least not for everybody. And when I said that, I blinked back tears because I love the church. And it breaks my heart to see her fractured. And he looked at me with a lot of compassion and said, "You're right." And what I wanted him to tell me was I was wrong. And he told me I was right. But then he said something that is good news, that didn't quite sound like good news at the time. Probably kind of like this sermon sounds to you all. But he says this. He said, if we were any other place than the church, and we determined that our model didn't work, we would ask ourselves what made the model work in the first place. And then he went on to say we were McDonald's. McDonald's was talking about finding their purpose. An outside marketer, or somebody, like him that knows about helping businesses, would tell McDonald's to get back into the business of doing what McDonald's does. And what does McDonald's do? They sell hamburgers. So I sort of sat there, and and looked at him like, you're pairing the church with McDonald's? Because the church is a lot more than hamburgers. But then I said, so the church has to get back to the business of God. And as soon as I said that, I thought, well, that's what we've always been in the business of. We've always been in the business of God. But those words kind of rung in my ears as I read this week's parable. And I think that Jesus is saying really the same thing to the temple and to the Pharisees and to the tax collectors and to every single other person who walks or crawls or runs up the steps of the temple. The lines of demarcation today are very different than they were 2,000 years ago. But they're still there. For example, there aren't so many young adults in the church anymore. And there aren't really that many children in the church anymore. And there aren't even very many of us who grew up in the church anymore. And the problem with that is, statistically speaking, people want to know God. It's not that they don't want to know God. Statistically speaking, they want to have a spiritual experience. They want to be in communion with God, and they're not coming to the church. So at the beginning, what I asked you was, what was the cause for separation? And does the church have any part in that? I think, sort of like I did with the kids here, I think sometimes we're the Pharisee and sometimes we're the tax collector. We're never, both, or we're never one or the other. So what I've been thinking about a lot this week is whether our loving the rightness of the church has actually gotten in the way of the purpose of the church. Not that this type of worship and this type of church would ever cease to exist. This has been around forever. But that more expressions of the church would rise up. And I don't think it's not just possible. I think it's God's dream. I think it's going to happen. And I might be a week early for Reformation Sunday, but there is a Reformation going on in the church today. One more piece of good news, and this is the cling to life kind of piece of good news. Is the temple, as we as Christians confess it, is not actually a building. It's not actually stones and mortar and bricks and steel. The temple is actually Jesus. We meet God in Christ. And in baptism, our temple becomes one another also because we're connected. There aren't any lines. And in some ways, in some very real ways that you could probably think about in your own lives, we house God for one another. Which means that the temple can move. Which means that the walls in the building can look many, many ways. It can look like this, it can look ornate, it can look plain, it can look like a coffee house, it can look like a bookstore, it can look like whatever. The temple can look so many ways. And that is glorious. The people of God all over the world have been on this journey with God for a millennium. And it seems like maybe we're on a new leg of the journey. Which is a little bit scary, but this parable opened up that they went up to pray. And it is through prayer that we also build this relationship with God, that we are sustained and fed. And so I want to close with this prayer, and this is one that you've probably heard before. It's one that's in our ELW, I think, part of evening prayer maybe. But I want to close with this. O God, you have called your servants to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, by paths yet untrodden through perils unknown. Give us faith to go out with good courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us and your love supports